So kia ora, ko Penny Hagen taku wingua, no Tamaki Makaurau ahau, kei te kauni hira o Tamaki Makaurau ahau e mahi ana e te Codesign Lab. So my name's Penny Hagen, I work at the Codesign Lab, which is part of Auckland Council. Specifically, we're embedded in the Southern Initiative in South Auckland, and our role at the Codesign Lab, my title is Co-Design Lead, and we support the teams here, the social entrepreneurs, community, and other stakeholders in South Auckland and across Council, as well as central government in their efforts, their transformative efforts using co-design and social innovation. Kia ora. So yeah, ethics in design or ethics in co-design is definitely something that I'm very interested in. It's very topical, but it has been topical for some time. It's not a new thing. And just to clarify, there's always been conversations about ethics and design. Most often when people are talking about ethics and design, they're talking about what it is that people might be designing, as opposed to how they're going about that. So ethics and co-design tends to be more focused on, well, how are we engaging people? How are we engaging in the power dynamics of that, particularly when it comes to government, which obviously sits with a great degree of power and authority, trying to engage with community effectively, and what are the ethics of that and supporting participation in a meaningful way. So not so much looking at who should we work with and is this product ethical or not, although those things are really important too, but much closer to a research and evaluation type ethics, where you're saying how are we involving people, who decides who's involved, who decides what happens to what they share, to their stories, who does the synthesis, and then what happens after. Is it put into action? How do we know it's been put into action? Those kinds of things. So because co-design has grown from a lot of different trajectories, and some of that is more of a design thinking, design management trajectory, one of the places that co-design's come from is that there hasn't been as much existing material or emphasis on that side of the ethics as you would see within more developed or mature disciplines such as research and evaluation, and even market research. So there isn't a well-established set of co-design ethics or protocols that people are aware of and subscribe to. So different people may be aware of different things that they've come across through their different pathways, but as a whole, those practicing co-design or human-centered design may well be doing so without having engaged actively in questions about ethics necessarily. Yep, so what we've been, when I say we, that's a combination of the people here, but also practitioners in Aotearoa, have been having a conversation for some time around what does ethics in Aotearoa look like. So we have a particular framework and set of obligations under the treaty that shape our practice, and that can also be really helpful for us in terms of thinking about ethics. And then we have some dynamics of practitioners just working in the field, and that more academic and health orientated ethics committees, and there's quite a gap often between those two worlds, and they're not necessarily intersecting, and so the work that we're trying to do is actually build those relationships, but also work out what are appropriate ethical processes and supports and protocols and practice for co-design, because it certainly shares many aspects with research. It shares a lot of aspects with participatory action research, but it is still, those doing it would say we're not doing capital R research in an academic setting. So what are the right practices and procedures? Should we be using ethics committees? Do we need something else as well, or something that complements some of those more conventional mechanisms for ensuring an ethical framework? There's many questions that come up in terms of engaging people. Some, for example, would be if we're going and speaking with people who are really from any background, but if we're doing anything in a social innovation context, it's often speaking with people who will have experienced some form of adversity or some form of trauma. So how are you having a safe conversation with that person? How are you making sure that your engagement with them is strengthening, not triggering? If it is triggering, what supports and follow-ups do you have in place? So people that have a very clear ethical framework around that might do things like at the beginning set the scene, provide some resource, say, if this is upsetting for you and you want to speak to someone afterwards, we've got this person on hand, or they may have things in place that preempt, as you do with traditional research, what you think may come out or what some unintended negative consequences might be. So that's just an example of some of the things. Some of the bigger ones are asking people for their input and their time, but then not being able to do anything as a result with that, and the cycle of kind of continually going back out and looking for community engagement and community's time, but then not delivering that through outcomes. And so sometimes either we have to get better at following through, or we should be checking, is this actually fair to be going out and asking again for more time if we can't guarantee that we can do something with what we hear. So that's another example of the ethical challenges, if you like. So there's lots of people, different teams may have their own ethical protocols. So like I say, the teams that have been working for a long time will probably be able to say to you, here's the set of things that we do. Some health teams refer to the NHS Codesign experience ethics principles that the NHS developed. Others would look at other existing ones, or they've got their own sets. What I would like us to do is make that much more visible and have something that's more collective, and so we're going to start an initiative from the Codesign Lab about that, to raise the profile of resources that already exist, but say, are they sufficient? Do they address things like the Treaty of Waitangi in terms of being appropriate for the New Zealand setting? And how can we, I think, two things: raise the visibility for practitioners of what ethical practice looks like, and provide some resource, could be training, could be guidelines that people can use, but also create access to people with experience that, like an external review, which is the role of what an ethics committee does, but perhaps more appropriate to the settings and context of co-design. Because often what people are doing when they're doing co-design is a service delivery response, and they're expected to work at a much faster pace than what you might see for traditional research and ethics processes. That's not the only reason why they're different, but it's one of the reasons why that mechanism isn't entirely appropriate for the co-design and service development work that we're seeing, say, in hospitals, or actually just healthcare, and hopefully within other parts of our government public service as well. Libraries is a great example. Yeah. So there's some other groups like the International, actually the acronym fails me just right now, but it's International Design for Development group, and they also recognise that some of the traditional protocols that are around didn't perfectly suit their setting, and so they're developing their own. They're going through a similar sort of process, looking at all the existing ethics protocols, comparing whether they're suitable or not, and developing their own thing. And I think we need to go through a similar process. At the beginning of the process, what are some of the ethical questions that you need to think about? So for example, who's commissioning it and what bias does that bring? Who's going to be involved and who gets to decide? How much influence do we have over the outcome? So therefore, how transparent can you be about what's going to change? As you go into trying to collect information, how are you going to do that? So we've got a draft set of questions that we can share. In the interim, I think the best thing for people to do is recognise that it's hugely significant, and make sure that they're asking people about whether what they're doing makes sense, and trying to find people that they can check in with. Auckland Council has an ethics committee which has a low risk ethics process, so at the minimum people can go through and just become familiar with what some of the standard ethics questions are. But I think our first port of call is just to make sure that people are even aware, because depending on what your background is, maybe you're not even sure of what you don't know. Yeah, obviously there's a danger of the whole silver bullet, design's going to fix everything, and there's a whole lot of things that design isn't very good at. Evaluative practice brings a whole lot of additional knowledge, community development brings a whole lot of additional knowledge, so it's really important that we hold design as one of the disciplines and knowledge bases that we can use, and I think it works really well as a framework, as long as you understand that there's heaps of things that design isn't great at, and we need to pull those from other places. One of the opportunities and the challenges, I think, in Aotearoa New Zealand is that there's incredibly strong value and knowledge and wisdom inside Indigenous knowledge systems. Mātauranga Māori in particular, around creativity and design practice, and there's massive opportunity in recognising that and fostering that. And the design thinking rhetoric that comes from overseas risks at times completely kind of missing the opportunity of what already exists here around creative practice and that way of working. And so I think there are times when we're doing quite well with that, and times when it's unhelpful to get carried away with a sort of what's like a North American and Northern European interpretation of what design is, when in fact we've got really strong design histories and traditions here that we can learn from within Māori culture, but also Pacific as well. So those are richness that isn't always recognised within the dominant design rhetoric, if you like, or dialogue. Yeah. So the Better by Design program that NZTE has run, which has had actually, I think, from my perspective, a really big influence on how accepted design became across different sectors in New Zealand, because we had different businesses getting exposed to this practice, and for a lot of those teams, I think they found the design process a really practical way to shift to a customer-centred or user-centred kind of focus. Like, oh yeah, we should actually go and talk to people and find out how they actually do things and what is going on in their life and how they're applying certain things. So, you know, I mean, in some cases that's been really useful. In other cases, what you see in a standard design toolkit is really focused on things like straight into the workshop, chop, we're going to be really creative, we're going to have all these ideas, and this kind of emphasis on pace and brainstorm, ideation. There's a few things in there that I think really need to be challenged in terms of whether that generates meaningful ideas, whether that's actually how good work is done, when people are asked to think off the top of their head really quickly with a bunch of people they don't know. And what it doesn't have in it at all is anything about tikanga or whanaungatanga, which are, they're common to Indigenous cultures, the concept of, so whakawhanaungatanga in terms of making connections and relationships and wanting to start with knowing who's in the room, what do you bring, how are we connected to each other. That's just an interpretation that has been shared with me of what whanaungatanga is. And that completely dictates how we should start and work together, and those things are absent from overseas versions of what design looks like. There's very little emphasis put on relationships, put on what it actually means to what you bring as a person into the room. It describes design as if it was in a vacuum, unvalue based, as if it doesn't have people driving it, sort of, where in fact what happens and what's produced and what comes out of it entirely depends on who's in the room, what they bring, the shape that they hold, the conversations that they're inviting or not inviting. And so the person and the people strangely are very absent from descriptions of design and design tools when we look at them in terms of off the shelf. There's lots of good reason for that, tools that are replicable get replicated, but yeah, there's huge aspects of actually what it takes to do good change work and how change actually happens that isn't encompassed in traditional Western design toolkits, that if you've got the opportunity to be led and participate in practices like kaupapa Māori, where starting with whakawhanaungatanga is not, that's where we must start. And over time you realise, of course, that's where we must start. How can we create anything together if we don't know who each other is or where we come from? If we're thinking about change, which is what design is about, you're trying to change from how things are now to something different in the future. And the way to make that happen is by people changing behaviours or making different choices, or organisations having different behaviours and making different choices, systems having different structures or different rules in them. And without people being connected, that doesn't happen. So that classic thing of, oh, we did this thing, but we didn't bring people along on the journey, and so they have no connection with that. Whereas if we think about design consistently as embedding the change right from the beginning, so every time we talk to somebody, we're seeding the potential for something to be different, or we're helping them build the capability or motivation to enact the different way of being that we're trying to move towards. So without that relationship work and without embedding it into practice change, or building the capacity for people or organisations to work differently, doesn't matter how pretty or good the design looks at the end, it won't be transformational. It won't stay embedded or be anchored. So when we put the emphasis on relationships and people, we're more honest about actually what it takes for things to be different. So I think you can't have effective design if you're aiming for transformational social innovation without it being completely relational. And because there's so many things that you're trying to change, there's so many. I mean, even if we just go, oh, there's one small thing that we want to change about a council procedure, there'll still be the backstage implications for that will be massive, and if it requires a decision-making buy-in or something to go through a committee, the mechanisms that are required to activate that change, it might look small from the outside, but if we don't have everybody lined up to get that across the line, it could just drop at any kind of moment. So yeah, not kind of engaging with the complexity of the humans behind the process, I think, is probably just a waste of time.
Mm.
I'm very interested in us moving much more into the space of connecting design and implementation. So for quite a long time, we were very stuck in what we've started to call the insights bulge. So you sort of gather all this great information, but then you get stuck, or you run out of energy, or you run out of budget, or you run out of time, or someone's invested in the learning part but not the implementing part. And as people have sort of done that for a little while and then realise that that's not effective, there's much more emphasis on actually getting into action and implementation. The work absolutely at the lab and the Southern Initiative has that connection on the ground. People are going out every day and working directly with their communities, doing and trying different things. So there is some work that's sort of in the studio, if you like, which is, the ideas, the initial paper prototyping, but then that's being taken out and communities and whānau are applying that, services are applying that and working out what does and doesn't work and continuing to prototype. So what we're seeing now is past what those initial sort of diagrams of the design process look like and out into live prototypes and in situ trialling and testing, which takes a whole different set of skills. And trying to embed what we can of evaluative mindsets and practice to be constantly saying, okay, we've done this, what does that mean? Is it working? What do we do next? And then the next question is, if you've been prototyping something for 8 months and changing it and trying lots of different things, how do you hand that back to the system so that it continues? How do you move it back into, BAU, as we often call it, or business as usual? What are the structures that have to be in place, the culture changes that have to be in place in order for people to say, we'll do that now and we'll stop doing this other thing, because there always has to be a stopping if there's going to be a starting. So I'm excited about the fact that we're out of the studio. We're not sort of doing the theory of design anymore, and this is what it could look like if only all these things were possible. The focus is much more, the social innovation is much more on the ground with people, but at the same time looking up and saying, we can make this change here right now, we could make this house warmer, but unless we get significant structural and policy shift as well, it'll only be this house and the 4 next to it. We want it to be 5,000 houses. So how do we it's not scaling the prototype necessarily, but it's scaling the learning that comes so that there's a structural shift as well as whatever's happening right in front of us. So the multi-level kind of ways of working is where I think we're learning the most, and we're only just sort of working out, what does that look like. I'm calling it like the third phase of design. We kind of work out what we want to do in those first cycles, prototype in those first ones, and then go, oh, okay, but this is actually what we're prototyping for real to try and extend and grow. And those are all, there's a whole different set of ethical questions that come up in that space, especially when we're talking about people who've already got a lot less resources to rely on and have already been down a whole lot of kind of really adverse roads, and so we need to prototype new things because what we've been doing for the last 20 years hasn't worked, but we also have to be very careful when we prototype because we're working with communities who are quite precarious in terms of, say, safety in their housing or safety in their work, compounded by real market conditions here, which is that it's impossible to find a house and housing quality is low, so there's a whole lot of very real things that put pressure on that social innovation space. Yeah. Well, I think getting really clear on what risk means, coming back to the ethical question, because we have a lot of totally rightly so legitimate questions around what is it possible that we will cause harm through this intervention, how will we make sure that that's not the case, but the risks are different if significant harm has already been caused and doing nothing also causes significant harm. So it's not straightforward. Might this person's scenario get worse? Well, if it does, we'll help people get through to whatever it takes to get a better outcome. So measures around what is risk are quite different when we've already created a scenario where people are under incredible pressure, under incredible toxic stress, have very little capacity left to make different decisions because they've kind of been stripped of those options and resources. So we talk about vulnerable people, be careful with vulnerable people, it's like yes, but also how do we create spaces for them to become less vulnerable if we're not working with people. So there's some questions about how we deem things to be risky when actually the status quo is very risky. Leaving people in really unhealthy homes, for example, or pushing people into really poor work conditions, those things are high risk too, but we're doing that all the time. So yeah, I think our idea of risk and difference and change and what we're prepared to do need to be kind of really looked at as problematic. And we have to be careful not to be really pious and sound like we're kind of, oh, this is wrong and we should be doing these things and doing these things. We're constantly attuned to the experiences that people are having and trying to use those in useful ways, but as Ingrid Burkett helps always reminding us, we have to have empathy right across the system. Why is it that situation has gotten to this point? Why is it that some of our services are doing more harm? And how do we start to unpack that? And I think we have to be careful not to make design sound like a silver bullet or anything, and in fact it's really just a code word for trying to work together differently, and trying new things and creating space for much more reflective practice, and being able to say that didn't work, what are we going to do about that, and definitely what happens is the lines are really blurred between when does your job finish and does your job finish, and the work that happens here is place-based, which means that that's with this particular community and this particular set of people. It's not with a anonymous population group, that it's people that this team is related to, that they'll know forever, the people that live here. It's not how design and research might have been framed in other ways where you're like, there's the user group, we'll go talk to them, but then they're still not kind of real. And so the closeness of the place-based work means things are different boundaries are crossed, and so people are also learning what that means in terms of the relationships. They're not 9-to-5 relationships. So there's lots of things. That's not so much something that concerns me, but more something that we're grappling with in terms of what does that mean? How does the team stay well and strong whilst working with something that's incredibly close to as part of their own lives, I guess. Yeah.